The immigration site to move to Canada crashed. Do you think people are going to really move to Canada? Do you think
I hope so. I hope so.
You want
Yeah,
people
there's
to move
too many people here, the rent's too high and all that. Just thin it out, give us a little negotiating thing, and then what's going to be funny up there, it's not going to be Michael Moore's Canada. What he said, oh, you keep your doors unlocked, and everybody's drinking syrup, and it's, yeah.
He didn't say everyone's drinking syrup. I'm quite
Talk
certain.
to anybody of color that tried to make it playing hockey up there. Listen to the stories they have. You'd be like, were you in Alabama? No, it was in Manitoba. Yeah, those are still white people up there.
Yeah.
Just because they're on the other side of the invisible line doesn't mean that they're not going to act like white people.
Yeah. So you're not a big fan of Canada, is what you're saying?
No, I love Canada, but I don't go up there with like this starry look in my eye, like everyone's going to be riding around on mooses, right? It's just like these people, they're human beings. They're selfish. They're into what they want. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Conan, I really don't, I don't pay attention to things.
I know. That's why I love getting your take. Do you think the debates had any impact at all? We had to watch so many debates. Do you think it had any impact on the election?
No, I think people already made up their mind. Like, I was dying laughing by the fourth one. I was just like, who are these people sitting there in the fourth debate going like, well, I don't know, but, well, that was a good point. But
hello, everyone. Welcome. And that was controversial comedian Bill Burr, his take on Canada, which is very similar to my take on Canada, a place I've spent a considerable amount of time in. We have a jam-packed show tonight. So let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog, Pascal Robert.
Yes, brother Jason Miles. How you living, my brother?
Good. You must be in a good mood because you came in like Shabba Ranks. He was like, like he's about to do a dance hall song.
You got jokes.
I do. So we also have our foreign, I almost said foreign correspondent, but he's pretty much our foreign policy expert. Also, he's a Canadian. Cuba. You're just Cuba.
The pleasure is mine. There's only one. There's only one of me. There's also that island in the Caribbean, but my lawyer says that I've got a very strong case, and by 2022, you'll expect a name change over there. I own the copyright. I've got the better IP position. You know, people know me. Cuba, what's that? It's even not pronounced correctly.
And then people say Cuba. They don't even say Cuba.
Yes, because they can't. This we're on the wrong side of the Vistula River.
And Pascal, would you like to introduce our guest for this evening?
Yes, I would like to introduce very well-renowned Haitian activist brother Jafrikayiti, Jean Seville, who has been a long-time advocate and activist on behalf of the Haitian people in Canada. We do have quite a few Haitians in Canada. He is a graduate of Waterloo University with a B.Sc in biology. He's an author, radio host, public speaker, activist, artist, and Canadian civil servant. He's the co-founder of two self-help organizations, AKASAN, Ayisyen qui a soutni Ayisyen nètalkole, and Jaku Konbit, which follow the principles popularized by Marcus Garvey. He's been a thorn in the side of the Canadian government for many years. Canada and the rest of the core group of influential foreign powers in Haiti could and should stop interfering in the governance of Haiti. So he is an expert in terms of Canada's role in Haitian affairs and overall, and I think we're going to learn from his perspective. Jean Saint-Ville, or Jafrikayiti.
Nah. Happy to be with you, brothers.
Thank you again for joining us. I was pretty excited. Pascal hit me up. I wouldn't say last minute, but he was like, "Hey, man, I got this great brother, this Haitian brother that's coming on the show. He's going to talk about Canadian politics." I was like, "What?" And then we were reading your bio, so I'm actually pretty excited for today. And then Pascal wrote some serious questions for you. Are you ready? Is the question. Are you prepared for this?
The questions
will
will
do
be,
my
I mean,
best.
Jeffrey, I mean, since your focus is Canadian Haitian policy, you'll probably get most of those questions. But the questions will be open to both of you. And our goal here is not to taint the Canadian government or say Canada is as bad as America. That's not the goal. But our goal is to complicate the narrative of Canada as some kind of mythological conflict-free nation, when we understand that it is a settler colonial notion. It had, it had a First Nations people that did lose their land and territory, and it does fit the paradigm of those kind of countries that were founded under European colonialism and imperialism. So we want to kind of explain what is really going on in Canada and what it's about. So I'll go straight to the questions if we are prepared. So this is going to be for either one of you. Canada has the perception of a country in North that has escaped the complicated, tortured racial history because of being the ultimate destination of the Underground Railroad, and the fact that Canada only had about 4,200 slaves in total between 1671 and 1834. Yet, having Black Canadian family myself, I'm aware that there is racism in Canada, and there's also a tortured history regarding the treatment of First Nations people, what we call Native Americans in the United States. Can you all, or either one of you, elaborate on the nuances of racism in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you allow me to start, I'll say that it's a very timely question, because there is a division of labor in the imperialist world that gives Canada the good cop job. And this is something that has been a characteristic of Canadian foreign policy for the longest time. And more with the demographics changing, you will see a number of people calling on Canada to come to maturity and to choose a different role for itself, as opposed to being always the little brother that the United States sends to do the dirty job because it will be less visible. But there would be a risk of presenting this as something that is new. Whereas you mentioned the Underground Railroad, which is part of the Canada Vignette, which used to be very present in every feature of Black History Month, etc. And it follows the typical approach that white liberals take when they deal with issues of racial slavery, colonization, etc. That is to go out of their way to find some kind of white hero to make the story more palatable. And so the Underground Railroad, what it refers to is the fact that given that the abolition of slavery in the British Empire happened before it happened in the southern states, enslaved Africans would find their way north all the way to Canada. And so there's quite a bit of migration that has taken place. But it always struck me as odd that, Harriet Tubman, the lady who escaped slavery in the United States, made it all the way to Canada and made it back 15 times to rescue folks, was never really the main character featured in all of these, Canada vignettes about the Underground Railroad. It was all about, the white Quakers who, did something extraordinary, not to diminish what they did, which is really relevant, but to have a woman who takes the risk more than 14 times to go back to where she came from, and to take that away from her. So Canada has that complicated way of presenting itself that is not at all honest. And it also showed up in 2007 when it was the bicentennial of the British Act to ban the so-called slave trade. That is the kidnapping of Africans by Europeans to be brought to the Americas by the British Empire. And William Wilberforce, the British legislator who played a role in that, was presented as the great hero. And in Canada, the character who was heralded as the hero is John Simcoe. What is often not spoken about is that this same John Simcoe, who is presented as a hero because he issued legislation to diminish slavery in Canada, is that in fact he was beaten by real abolitionists in Haiti as part of the British Army. There's also something that's often forgotten is that the island of Haiti, that the French renamed Santo Domingo or Saint-Domingue, was inhabited at various times by the British, the Spanish, and the French. And Simcoe went with the British Army to re-enslave freed Africans, and he was beaten so badly that he had to run back to Canada. And this is the guy that, with the power of white supremacy, that in 2007, along with William Wilberforce, who, by the way, did not agree with the freeing of Africans. He said that it would be a big mistake to free the Africans right away, that it would ruin economically the owners and the slaves, and that it had to be a gradual thing. And so this is, Canada does not escape the fact that to this day, the inheritors of the crime of racial slavery have not managed to look squarely at history and take the lessons, the right lessons from it, from my opinion.
So I think that that's an excellent observation, especially the need to find a sort of a white Canadian hero figure that can balance the moral ledger between with the individuals that maintained slavery, that brought in African slaves to the North American colonies. There's an instinctive desire for Canadians who, and I mean, it's a universal impulse. You want your country to be good, and you find ways of telling historical narratives about the ugly experiences that your country was involved in that somehow have a comfortable, reassuring narrative and a comfortable, reassuring moral at the end that, in the end, the good guys won and we were the good guys. I think that Canada it was largely a matter of luck that Canada wasn't more deeply implicated in the transatlantic slave trade compared to the United States. And it had to do with climate. If Canada had been located in the Caribbean, then the history would be completely different, and you'd probably have a very substantial legacy of slavery. But it was too cold for indigo, too cold for cotton, too cold for any of the plantation crops that were very lucrative, too cold for sugar. And instead you had a bunch of empty space that first gave rise to a fur trade, which created a very complicated and ugly dynamic with the First Nations, and later with the opening of the interior through the Canadian Pacific Railroad, made for a very reassuring story of white agricultural settlement. You have the Ukrainian sod huts in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and all of these penniless European farm folk that were often the most, came from very humble and very difficult circumstances that could start a prosperous and free life in Canada. And so you lean into those parts of the narrative and you avoid the ones that that show some ugly sides to the country. Although Justin Trudeau, part of his brand is precisely this notion of reconciliation with Native American, with First Nations people, with Indigenous people, and a kind of woke anti-racism. So there's been a lot more official attention on the difficult and challenging parts of Canadian history when it comes to race relations. Canada's role in slavery, and the stories of the relatively small number, but significant in human terms, unfree people that that did live in the pre-Canadian British North American colonies. So the legacy is very challenging, and I wish that Canada, I wish that every country would get over the need to moralize its history. The things that Canada achieved that are good, that are substantial, things like healthcare, a relatively egalitarian society, relatively peaceful multicultural coexistence, and more recently, some very tenuous and basic steps towards Indigenous reconciliation. Those are good. Those aren't expressions of fundamental virtue. Often they were sensible things to do, and things and types of reforms and types of policy measures and social adjustments that were easy because of things like a high level of development, low land pressure, low security threat environments. So, Canada is kind of playing on the easy setting of world history. That said, it's doing not a terrible job, but it shouldn't be taking a moral victory lap. Just like there shouldn't be too much castigation over what happens in some countries where conditions are just so harsh that they leave societies and governments with very little room to maneuver in terms of reconciliation and human rights.
Jeffrey, do you have anything you want to add to that? Do you want to have any clarifications you want to add? I see I see our Canadian sister Sarah Onyango is making comments.
Exact.
I know Sarah very well. She's a Canadian journalist and she's watching. Shout out to Sarah Onyango.
Shout out, Sarah. Thanks for checking the show out, Sarah. Appreciate you.
Yes, and the point Sarah makes here is very important. That is to recognize that both the British and the French are colonizers who basically built their empires on the backs of enslaved people and stolen territory. And so, for instance, one of the famous enslaved people in Quebec was a gentleman named Mathieu Léveillé, who was captured in Martinique and offered by the French the choice of either becoming the butcher in Quebec or that he was going to be killed. And so it's a very fascinating story because there are many layers of connections between Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean. So because Haiti was colonized by the French, many of the French who were themselves fleeing France for persecution because they were from the lower class, they themselves became enslavers in New Orleans, in places like Haiti, etc. So it's a complicated story.
We're going to go there. We have some more questions. Another myth that Canada benefits from is the notion that Canada is not tainted by imperialism. Yet few know that Canada is one of the biggest arms dealers in the Middle East, and that Canada not only supports the U.S.'s hostile treatment of Venezuela, but also has a tortured relationship with Haiti. Can you discuss various Canadian foreign policy overreaches, like its arms sales to Saudi Arabia, as well as others?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the Haiti file is the one that I'm the most familiar with. But here again, we can go as far back as the incarceration of Nelson Mandela, putting Nelson Mandela on the terrorist list. And of course, most Canadians, what they know about Canada and apartheid is that Canada played an amazing role in the release of Nelson Mandela. But in reality, all of this is manufactured stories. You look closer and you see when Nelson Mandela was released, the fact that he went to Cuba to thank Fidel Castro and insisted on his relationship with Muammar Gaddafi was because when he was a young man fighting the white supremacist state, well, he didn't have any friends in white North America and in Europe. In fact, they played a role in getting the Boer regime to capture him and steal his youth from him. And some people are aware of it, but in 2007, Winnie Madikileza Mandela, who was never liked because she is an African of the type that doesn't compromise with white supremacy, she was denied a visa, an entry visa to Canada in 2007. So this to say that whatever I'm going to be talking about with regards to Canadian foreign policy towards Haiti is not something unusual or something that departs from what has been done, whether it is in South Africa or in the Congo, as essentially a white supremacist movement is a global movement. And this is something that's seldom discussed, that the fraternity that exists among white supremacist states never stopped. So most of your viewers are probably aware that Haiti is a country that gained its independence by fighting the armies of Britain, Spain, and France. It's the only place in the Americas where Napoleon Bonaparte's army was defeated. And it happened at a time when there were wars in Europe between the British and the French and the Spanish, etc. But it so happens that the Americans and the French were all very clear in their minds that although Haiti, having defeated the army of Napoleon, made it easy for the United States to double its size by acquiring Louisiana. And Louisiana is not the state that we know today. It was half of what we call the United States of North America today. And the only reason the United States could purchase Louisiana for such a cheap price was because Napoleon Bonaparte had lost all hope of his empire in the Americas, having lost Haiti, which was the most prosperous colony, more prosperous than all 15 British colonies together, combined in terms of products, annual products. So that said, it's important to note a statement from Prince Charles Talleyrand, who was foreign minister of France at the time. He wrote to James Madison, who was Secretary of State before he became president of the US. And he said, "The existence of the Negro people in arms is a terrible threat for all white nations in the world." And so the United States started with an embargo against the liberated African state of Haiti. And so, these people had liberated themselves, but they couldn't trade with anybody. And so they were, in a sea surrounded by hostile white supremacist states that practiced racial slavery. So, of course, Haiti won its independence in 1803. Britain did not abolish slavery until 1833, which means the same thing for Canada, and the United States, 1865. So in that context, you have to put it there as a continuation of those policies when you find out that in 2003, January 31st, February 1st, 2003, there was a meeting right here where I live in Gatineau of all white leaders from the United States, Europe, Latin America. They were discussing the future of Haiti, and there was no Haitian invited to the discussion. And these white people, men and women who met, decided that they will put Haiti under UN tutelage. They will overthrow the Haitian president, who, I remind you, was an elected president. His election was by far more democratic and predictable than the election of George Bush in the year 2000, the same year. You all remember what happened in Florida, where Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, helped him become president. Now, what happened is that these white men and women who met and decided they're going to put Haiti under UN tutelage, less than 13 months later, white soldiers, which we do not have in Haiti, entered the residence of the president, kidnapped him and his wife, and took him to the Central African Republic, where he was kept in exile for a while. And then you had Danny Glover, Amy Goodman, Maxine Waters from the U.S. Congressional Black Caucus, who went there and rescued President Aristide so that he could return to the hemisphere, but he couldn't go back to Haiti because by then Haiti was occupied by the white supremacist states, and a puppet prime minister was put in place. And so he had to go to Jamaica, where he was reunited with his two small daughters. And then they found exile in South Africa, where he remained for 7 years. Now, this is an extraordinary story. Most people cannot understand that in 2004, which was the bicentennial of the end of racial slavery in the Americas, starting in Haiti, a gang of white leaders meet and seriously decide that they're going to kidnap the president of Haiti. And they insisted, if you read the article by Michel Vastel, they insisted that this must happen before January 1st, 2004. And the justification that the Canadian minister, Denis Paradis, gave for that was that in his estimation, by 2019, there were going to be 20 million Haitians. And he described it, and I kid you not, you can go and read on the internet the quotes. He said that having 20 million Haitians living in poverty so close to them by 2019 is a time bomb that needs to be diffused immediately. I don't know. I may be the only person who is shocked by that, but I still cannot understand how, in this day and age, people can talk about Black human beings as a time bomb. And so this idea that Haitians are mouths that are feeding too much, consuming too much food, they don't realize these are brains, these are, hardworking people. And what crime did they commit? They chose their own president. As you might have followed, President Aristide, who is a scholar, him and his wife, a professional couple, they returned from exile in 2011, and they said they were going to invest in education. And I can tell you now, if you look at the numbers of graduates from medicine, from engineering that are coming from the university that he created, it's a shame. And we don't have any evidence that whenever Haiti had a legitimate government, that it was helped by the self-claimed friends of Haiti. But what we have as evidence is that every time, just like Brother Bob Marley sings, every time we plant a seed, they say, kill it before it grows. This is the struggle of the Haitian people. And I use the word white supremacy, and I know that some people don't like that term. Unfortunately, that's what the evidence points to me.
I know Kuba wanted to follow up real quick.
Well, it's funny because part of my follow-up is to complicate the idea of this being intrinsically white supremacy, because there's a similar dynamic that plays out in Eastern Europe, where it's white-on-white violence. the grandfather of the current Canadian foreign minister, Christiana Friedland, was from Ukraine, Mikhailo Homiak, and he came to Canada after World War II, along with a large number of displaced people and post-war refugees, except he was leaving Europe to escape accountability for collaboration with the Nazi regime, with the Third Reich. He ran a propaganda paper out of my birthplace, Kraków, Poland, in which he sought to mobilize Ukrainian nationalism and weaponize it against Eastern European Jews, Poles, communists, the Soviet Union. And he was involved in a number of fascist and Nazi collaborationist militia movements that carried out substantial atrocities, killing hundreds of thousands of people across Ukraine. And he came to Canada. He lived an untroubled life, prospered in Alberta, and his granddaughter has become the Canadian foreign minister, and she has been very closely involved in the NATO Western efforts to use Ukraine as a proxy battlefield against Russia. She has sponsored and pushed the anti-Russian government in Kiev, and the current president of Ukraine is that he was elected fairly. However, the pro-Russian government that was deposed in the Maidan revolution, that was also a fairly elected democratic government, but various factions of Ukrainian society, including the Ukrainian far right, including nationalist groups that were the direct successors of those Nazi collaborationist fascist militias, overthrew organized protests. There were also liberals, there were also sort of regular disgruntled Ukrainians involved, but the far right was definitely one of the major forces that led to the end of the Yanukovych government and the beginning of this kind of Atlanticist pro-NATO Ukraine. And she has been active in trying to secure as much support as possible for Ukrainian groups fighting Russia, including now paramilitarized fascist, not nationalist organizations that stem directly from those same Ukrainian extremists that participated and perpetrated parts of the Nazi Holocaust in Eastern Europe. It's easy to forget for those of us who live here that the West, that we all know and love, that, you know, the West that gave us Barack Obama as president and Michel Jean as Canadian Governor General, is the direct successor to the Cold War West, the World War II era West, which served its own interests and had an agenda that included the perpetuation of its economic and political domination worldwide. And prior to the kind of turn in the early to mid 20th century, practiced intensely racist, ethnocentric policies, targeted substantially against people of color, but also European ethnicities that were considered to be inferior, undesirable, or too communist adjacent.
I'm sorry, Kuba. I'm sorry.
No. Please go ahead.
No, I wanted to ask a question. We have a super chat question from Angie K. Shout out Angie K. Appreciate you. Does Canada have a militia culture?
Oh, I think I should take this because I'm from the West. I lived in Ottawa, and Ottawa didn't really seem to have a militia culture. But where I'm from, things are a little different. I grew up in interior British Columbia, and I live here now. And the Alberta Alberta especially has a culture that's much closer and much more derivative from Texan conservative U.S. Christian culture than the rest of the country. There is no Second Amendment in Canada, so there's less of a national fetishization or fixation on weapons. But the idea of training in the woods, the idea of separatism, the idea of survivalist type organizations, that does exist in Western Canada. It's not the same extent and not the same intensity as in the United States, but there are offshoots of different extremist survivalist groups and white supremacist groups in Western Canada. Generally, the society is hostile to them. It's not very understanding, but they exist, and there's enough slack, or there's enough just personal freedom, so they can organize, and as long as they mind their P's and Q's, it's, the state won't mobilize against them, but they're here.
I mean, what's interesting for me, right, is that two of the biggest alt-right personalities that have arisen in America come from Canada, with Jordan Peterson and Stefan Molyneux. How do you guys put them in the context of Canadian
Don't forget
society?
Gavin McGinnis, founder of the Proud Boys.
Proud Boys and not Vice. Yeah, Vice magazine.
Yeah, it was Vice. Yeah. The so let me take this one because it has to do with white people. And there's
wait, how do you square that though, Kuba? Like, I feel like the shittiest white people on the right now are coming from Canada, and Jordan Peterson makes his bones getting mad about a law that was never enforced.
Yep. So there's like one thing to remember is that the aggregate does not reflect the individual components. So you can have society that's oriented one way, but that doesn't mean that there aren't individuals who hate everything about it and are pointing in the exact opposite direction. And until the 1960s, until the Trudeau turn, which ended racist immigration laws, I saw that was a question in the chat. There were absolutely racist exclusionary laws against immigration for non-whites right up until the 60s. Until then, Canada was in much more of a sort of the mainstream of Anglo-Saxon white supremacy. What happens in the 60s is not that every white person changes their mind. What happens is that the non-racist or the progressive or the less, however you want to define them, right? The nice white people, they win the political question. They win the political issue under pressure from minorities within Canada. And the racist whites then have to deal with the fact that they are a minority in their country and that the culture is drifting further and further away from where they're comfortable. Vancouver goes from a place which burns out its Chinatown every 20 or 30 years in the late 19th century and has Klan rallies right through the downtown core in the early 20th century to a majority minority city with extensive, probably a plurality of the population is Asian, many people from China, many people from India, many mixed race marriages, many, and just a tremendous amount of contact between different groups. The racist whites just don't go there, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. It means you don't see them because you don't go to the places where they are. But they do exist. And the ones that have to be in those environments because they have a teaching job at a university or they're there professionally, they get crazy. because they're isolated and they're surrounded by precisely what they hate. Then they go online and they become Stefan Molyneux, right? And I think that pattern reproduces itself time and time again. There's also an incredible market for the non-Southern accented, cosmopolitan, Anglophone, Fox and further right personality in the United States. You show up and you don't come off as a redneck, you don't come off as a Klansman, because your background and your accent suggests that you're not from the kind of heartland of bad American racism. But you know how to speak the code to go right up to that line and like just nudge your foot over it a little. People love that on the internet. People love that in certain American media outlets. So it's an excellent export market for the type of alt-right crazy that germinates in some like Canadian brains.
Yeah.
Did not know we were going to go down a rabbit hole of Canadian racism, did you, everybody?
It's there, right? Like
it's so that, you know, what really made me mad was when, I don't know if you guys remember this, and I'm sure you two wonderful scholars remember this. It was a few years ago, maybe like 4 years ago, where there was a thing about benches in the States. They have a bar in the middle so homeless people can't sleep there. That's why we have benches in major cities where it's really hard for people to sleep in them. And then Canada was like, we're fine with that. And then I can't remember what province it was. They made a bench with a hood. And they were like, see how much better we are? And I was like, have you been to Vancouver? Like, have you been to the interior of the country? Have you seen how these cats have treated their First Nations? Like,
I'd actually like to hear more about that. Can we talk about the treatment of the First Nations people, or what we call Native Americans in the United States? Do any of you guys have any particular stories, narratives, anecdotes, facts, figures, data?
Hold on, Cooper. You over here taking up this gentleman's time.
Yeah.
No?
I'm just politely putting up my hand.
Yeah, politely. Very Canadian. But I must say, honestly, it's not all myth. The fact that there is a more polite type of racism here in Canada. I think the danger of it is that people might not understand how dangerous it is in terms of being latent. So you mentioned the relationship with the First Nations people. This has been something that has been discussed in Canadian society more and more. So, for instance, now it's a routine gesture that whenever there's some kind of official venue or event, that there's an acknowledgement that we are on unceded territory, because not all of the territory was part of those treaties that were signed during the time of colonization. And so more and more Canadians are becoming aware that something needs fixing here. However, I'm afraid that if it remains the way it is, what is going to happen is just the buildup of frustration, because people are not being educated to face the true history of the country. And so a lot of white people are growing up with the idea that they're doing a favor to First Nations people, they're doing a favor to immigrants who are coming to the country, and not understanding exactly, especially when we're talking about this coming to the mainstream, because there's a serious effort. I mean, I shouldn't say serious, because we haven't seen the results yet, but there is a visible effort on the part of the government in the last few decades. First, there was this movement of multiculturalism, to say that we celebrate multiculturalism. And now there's this whole thing about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and they've added decolonization in some places now. Okay, to say that it's not acceptable, for instance, if you go on the board of directors of the main public broadcaster, CBC, and it's all white men and women. Okay, people realize that there's a problem there. You have like thousands of Black, Chinese, other Canadians who are graduating from the journalism schools, but they don't make it. They don't make it to the main broadcaster, either French or English. Now, gradually, this is happening, except that it is happening in a very Canadian way. People, for instance, you don't have debates on Canadian television about the state of the nation, about how First Nations people are being treated. There is one good thing, though, on the First Nations part, that they have their own TV broadcasting programming. But what it does is that you realize very quickly, if you spend any time watching APTN, which is the Aboriginal People Television Network, what they're talking about is not what's being talked about in the so-called mainstream. And that is problematic. I have had the privilege of traveling from every end of Canada and visiting up north in Nunavut. And it's a shame that today we have communities that don't have clean running water in Canada. And it's not something that's happening now. I mean, we had consecutive surpluses in our budgets. Every year you hear about millions and millions and of dollars being dedicated to solve the problem, but it's never solved. And you're dealing with very fragile communities because it's very small numbers of people living in large territories. And I think that's another thing that we should always keep in mind when we're doing this comparison game between Canada and the United States. I mean, you're talking about 10 times less people. And, the Canadian population is all mostly in cities that are about 200 kilometers from the US border. So obviously, if you're talking about militias and things like that, you cannot compare it with something that's happening in the southern states in the US. These are very isolated pockets, but it's latent and it's there. And that's why, I think that there is an important work that needs to be done for this generation and the next, so that people come out of those false narratives that their parents grew up with, that Canada is better than the U.S. We've never had slavery, which is not true, and also we have Africans who've been in this country from the very beginning. I mean, Matthew da Costa, it's an African man who was translating for the so-called French pioneer. So if he was translating between him and the First Nations, that means he was there before him. Okay, so, and you have other situations where, and I know at the beginning of the show, you talk about the hockey situation. I've had the privilege of meeting some young Canadians, Black Canadians in Nova Scotia, who tell horror stories about how, as soon as they started to be better than their white counterparts, they started to be harassed and eventually discouraged from playing hockey. So there are latent problems dealing with racism. And now I think we have a serious issue here with regards to anti-Asian racism that is likely to rise because of the geopolitics if it's not treated properly.
Okay, I think you have some excellent observations, and certainly the condition of First Nations and First Nations communities in Canada is the poverty, the entrenched racism, especially in the prairies, but also in British Columbia, all over really the burning of the Micmac lobster fishery, for instance, the Highway of Tears. There's clearly a very substantial undercurrent of indigenous sentiment that can be murdersome, can be outright murderous, can be violent, can be very brutal. Regardless of the sort of official line of Justin Trudeau, I would say that the mainstream press actually does devote a fair amount of coverage for issues related to indigenous people. If you watch or read the CBC, it does come up. It is an area of concern. And I would point out that legally and structurally, there's been a significant amount of change that's occurred very rapidly, given the situation that Canada was in, even if you go back to the 80s, if you go back earlier than that, prior to the patriation of the Constitution. For instance, Nunavut exists. A territory was created in order to establish a Inuit majority political unit, and it operates on the same laws and principles, the same rules as the Northwest Territory and the Yukon. That's a significant change. That's a major development and a major improvement, I would say. Similarly, the condition in British Columbia, where I'm from, for First Nations, the land claims are a major issue. We started when my family first arrived to Canada in a situation where First Nations people were just driven off their land at the point of a gun as the railroad was being built east from Vancouver. Land was simply seized. No documents, no treaties. It was pure theft, plunder at its most simple. The First Nations communities that were the successors to the people dispossessed challenged that in the British Columbian court system. It made its way to the Supreme Court, and the decision was that since this was theft, since you don't even have a treaty signed like you did in other parts of Canada, you cannot confine First Nations land claims. That the Aboriginal title, as they technically term it, was never extinguished, and the government of Canada and the government of British Columbia must negotiate compensation and restoration of First Nations land rights. So they're as serious as many of the problems are. I don't want to revert to a position where every country is a white supremacist hellhole and there's no hope and there's latent racism that's going to prevent us from addressing these challenges, or coming to a better living arrangement, or necessarily treating it as a strictly attitudinal issue. There's people there's racism in people's minds, and therefore we can't make progress. Institutionally, there has been a substantial amount of change that has improved conditions for First Nations people. And similarly with multiculturalism, I grant you that I'm probably the easiest case being a white ethnic, but there's support for Polish language education and minority languages broadly, funded by the Canadian government. Multiculturalism, flawed though it is better than a lot of the alternatives to cross-cultural coexistence. And there is a gap between rhetoric and reality, but as serious as it can be, and as important as it is to maintain pressure on and prevent this kind of Canadian smugness for creating an attitude of complacency. One of the most maddening attitudes that I come across is this notion that as long as we stay a little bit ahead of the United States, we're fine and nobody can criticize. Certainly, that's not acceptable. Certainly, Canada has to live up to its rhetoric and to its promises. And I think that there's potential for that improvement to continue. There's going to be a serious risk of pushback. The Jordan Peterson, Stéphane Molyneux Gavin Newsom phenomenon. Interestingly enough, some of the most enthusiastic fans of, especially someone like Jordan Peterson, are visible minority young men in Canada. He has a cross-racial young male appeal to his kind of intellectual professor daddy shtick. And and some of the racial issues, some of the problems with multiculturalism in Canada actually stem from conflicts that are not racial but ethnic in basis. Meaning, for instance, Filipino Canadians and South Asian Canadians will occasionally have communal tension between groups, and the RCMP is called in. It's a white guy who has no idea what he's doing because there's no coming to grips with a multicultural problem that isn't a white person problem. And I think that Canada, one of the ways that it's playing on easy, but also one of the legacies that I think is at the greatest risk in terms of changes in Canadian culture, is the fact that white identity has not been consolidated in the same way that it has in the United States. The founding dichotomy in the United States was white and black, free and slave. The founding dichotomy in Canada was Franco and Anglo, putting aside the relationship with First Nations and Native Americans, which I know is a huge caveat. But within the colonial societies, that was the fundamental dichotomy. And in the United States, that dichotomy was dealt with through force, exploitation, direct violence. In Canada, there was a real subordination. The French Canadians were a conquered people. And this had nothing to do with superior morality. This had nothing to do with a higher culture. Simply making the calculation that if all of these French are pissed off and all of the First Nations are pissed off and we have a problem with the colonists in the US, we can't afford too harsh a regime in Quebec and in the Maritimes, well, especially Quebec. So we're going to accommodate their religion and their language. And that accommodationist first step, and this is my personal interpretation, gave rise to a society of compromise, sometimes very grudging, sometimes very slow, sometimes very reluctant. But that created a pattern which could later be applied to white ethnics, which could later be applied to visible minorities, and is now very belatedly being applied to Indigenous and First Nations Canadians. And I think that there's potential there. I'm not going to say that it's a done deal and that in 100 years.
Well, let me ask my Canadian comrades. Sorry, I wasn't trying to, and I apologize for cutting you off, Kuba. Before the hour is over, isn't there some pushback though on some of the Muslim? Was it Montreal that has a law about hijabs?
Yeah, and they basically followed what was happening in France, and but I think it's linked to what Kuba was just talking about. In Canada, instead of having confrontation, the two white solitudes just ignored everybody else. It's basically a narcissistic approach where basically they talk about two founding solitudes, the French and the English, completely ignoring the First Nations people who were there, completely ignoring the Africans who came with the so-called discoverers, completely ignoring the Asians who built the railroad and all of that. And so, to me, this hasn't solved the fundamental problem. White settlements all over the planet followed the same pattern, whether it is in New Zealand, in South Africa, in the United States of Canada. I mean, they just adapted to the local reality and made some adjustments. And I think the other risk here, when we focus on the so-called white extremist, is to simply find a convenient scapegoat not to address the issue. Just like, for instance, in the United States, you know, as a Haitian, I am not worried that a fool like Donald Trump called my country a shithole. That's not my concern. My concern is that whether it is Donald Trump, Barack Obama, or George Bush, their policies are making Haiti a shithole country. That's the problem. And today, after so many people have put their hopes on Joe Biden, he's already sent more
More Haitians back than the
more
Trump
Haitians
regime,
back
right?
to Haiti than Donald Trump did. Okay, so white supremacy. I mean, some white people might find that it's nicer to have it. You know, how do they call these things? You know, when you have decaffeinated. We don't care whether you make it nicer with a smile or not. It's just in 2021, we need to be more civilized than that. And in Canada, unfortunately, a lot of people, and I've seen some of the people commenting here, saying that it's really putting the bar very low if we keep on comparing ourselves to the United States. In order to say that we're not as bad, but it's worse than that. The fact is, a lot of the things that Canada get away with is because we are not even acknowledging the true state of our country. So, for instance, I mean, I've been to Venezuela a few times, and one of the reality that people are not aware of, the Venezuelan people are black people. Okay, we have a large black population in Venezuela, and you know, President Hugo Chavez, when he spoke about his pride as with his of his black heritage, a lot of people frown on that. But that's also because in Latin America, you have that very similar situation where they hide the black population, and you know, the people you see on TV, you know, happen to be just like in Dominican Republic. Some people think white people live in Dominican Republic. But the fact is, there's a racial dimension to the crisis in Venezuela. Okay? And I spoke with black Venezuelans, and you have your Chavistas who were burnt to death by right-wing white Venezuelans. Okay? And oftentimes in the media, even the so-called mainstream media or progressive media, they evacuate this issue because it's not convenient to talk about it. Okay? So I think we need to realize that it's not like there are some racist whites and some good whites. White supremacy doesn't care. It doesn't even care whether you're white or black. Okay, Colin Powell was supporting white supremacy during the whole time he was there. And I would argue that Barack Obama, by sending bombs in Africa, was supporting white supremacy. You see, white supremacy doesn't ask you whether you agree or not to join in. It just shows up, and you have to make a special effort to say you reject the white privilege that comes with either your lighter skin. For instance, I'm a lighter skin Haitian, okay? And there's white privilege that I can benefit when I'm in Haiti. I have to reject it. And to me, it's problematic that when we're talking about people who fought slavery, you know, the names that come up are William Wilberforce or Victor Schlossler. All of these fools never really wanted slavery to end. Whereas a man like John Brown, who was a white man, took up arms and fought against white supremacy. And when he was captured by the US and killed in 1859, okay, it was Haiti that decreed 3 days to honor John Brown. And the impoverished people of Haiti collected money, $20,000 at the time, to send to the widow of John Brown. to me, we need to really look at the fact that white supremacy is mainstream. It's not some isolated thing. And otherwise, what you're going to have is people tell you that, well, in Canada, we've had Michaëlle Jean as Governor General. She was nothing. It's a figurehead position. She represented the Queen of England. Okay? When the issue of reparations was being discussed in 2001, there was no one in authority in Canada to stand up and say, well, yes, this is a good thing to think about repairing the damage that was caused to the First Nations people of Africa and of the Americas. Instead, Canada joined the white supremacist states and boycotted the Durban Conference. To me, to have a woman like Michaëlle Jean becoming Governor General of Canada, if it was really more than a symbolic thing, she would have been the first champion of reparations. We didn't see it. And so I think there's a risk here that, especially with this Black Lives Matter movement now, when every white leader takes a knee, takes a public gesture, and then next month another Black person gets killed, and then we're back in the streets again claiming Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. We really need to look at this thing much deeper. And I can tell you, the stats don't lie, okay? If you go to jail, to the federal jails in Canada, you will think that demographics of Canada is much different. The jails are Black in Canada.
The jails are also
that doesn't make
indigenous.
sense.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
And indigenous.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. Like we don't even represent. I don't think we're 12% of the. We're 9% of the population. No, we're 3% of the population in Canada, and we're already 10% of the federal jails. That doesn't make sense. We don't commit more crimes.
And how do you reconcile that with the fact
we're at an hour? We're at an hour,
Black
Pascal. We're at an hour, Pascal. You just totally ignored the whole thing I wrote you in the chat. It's good that you just. That's a very passive-aggressive middle finger you threw at me, Pascal.
The brother Jug got me. Brother Jug got me with the mass incarceration thing.
Well, let's ask the question that we always ask at the end of the hour. Can you stick around for a little bit longer? I know it's later where you are, and if you can, it would be very much appreciated, because we would like to dig a little deeper into what you've been talking about. You see, Pascal is so fired up. He kicked me in the testicles and pushed me aside over the hour thing.
Are we in the same show?
So if you're down, if you have to go, I totally understand. I know it's late where you are. You're down?
Yeah.
Oh, you said nothing but a word. All right.
We're gonna send you another link to the
post game.
It's the after hours. The post game is another show. I'm trying to trademark this, Kuba.
After hours.
You just white supremacy all over my. No, I'm just playing. I'm messing with y'all. So,
so you're gonna take questions from the audience? Or?
Yeah. With the next part, the chat's actually gonna be on the screen so you guys can see it. Because right now you're only seeing kind of select quotes that I show. And when we go into the after hours part, it's only patrons. So it's people that actually are patrons of the show that pay a small monthly fee, and we give them special bonus content. Pascal actually had very long questions that I will honestly say were slightly longer. There wasn't more, but they were slightly longer than the Adolph Reed questions. So there's a few more questions Pascal has to ask. We're gonna keep hammering away at this Canada stuff. Jean Bajlan is gonna join us to talk a little bit about what's going on with the Kurds, because it's Foreign Policy Thursday. So if we're not talking about Marx, we're probably talking about foreign policy on Thursday. So thank you guys for paying attention. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you guys so much for the super chats. That was huge. So if you guys are patrons, the link should be up to the show. If not, of course, send me a barrage of messages about how I'm not moving fast enough, and I will get it up in a hurry. So thank you guys, and we are